Imagine you are an Irish peasant farmer in 1846. You live in a small stone cottage in County Cork with your wife and 4 children. You work land that you do not own. It belongs to a British landlord who lives in England and has never set foot on this farm. You grow potatoes for your family to eat, and you grow wheat and oats that the landlord takes to sell in England. That is the arrangement. You keep the potatoes, he takes everything else. But this year, something is wrong. You dig up your potatoes and they are black, rotting, covered in a strange fungus. The entire crop is destroyed. Your family's food for the year gone. You are terrified. But you look at the fields of wheat and oats growing tall and golden. There is food, lots of it, enough to feed your family through the winter and beyond. You think maybe the landlord will let you keep some of the grain this year, just enough to survive. The landlord's agent arrives with armed men. They load the wheat onto carts, all of it. You beg them to leave something, anything. Your children are hungry. The agent says the rent is due. The grain belongs to the landlord. It is going to England. You watch the carts roll away. Your family has nothing. Winter comes. Your children grow thin. Their bellies swell from hunger. You boil grass and nettles to make soup. It is not enough. Your youngest daughter dies first, then your son. Your wife is too weak to stand. You walk to the nearest town looking for help. The streets are filled with skeletal figures. Bodies lie in ditches. The workhouse is overflowing. There is no help. And every day you watch carts loaded with Irish wheat, Irish beef, Irish butter roll past you towards the ports, protected by British soldiers, heading to England, while your family starves. This is not a hypothetical scenario. This happened. Ireland, 1845 to 1852. The Great Famine. 1 million people died of starvation. Another million fled the country. But here is what will make you furious. Ireland was producing food, massive amounts of food, enough to feed the entire Irish population multiple times over. But it was all being exported to England. 40 shiploads of food left Ireland every single day during the worst years of the famine, while 1 million Irish people starved to death. The British government had the power to stop it. They could have closed the ports, stopped the exports, distributed the food to the starving population. They chose not to. Politicians argued that interfering with food exports would violate free market principles, that providing relief would make the Irish dependent on aid. So they watched 1 million people die and called it a natural disaster. Welcome to If History Repeats. Today, we go back to Ireland, 1845, to the famine that was not a famine, the food that was shipped away while people starved, and the government that chose profit over lives. And then we ask, does this still happen today? Are people still starving while food is exported for profit? Let's begin.
Ireland in 1845 was under British rule. The population was over 8 million people. Most Irish were poor tenant farmers, working land owned by British landlords. The system was feudal. Irish farmers grew crops on land they did not own and paid rent to absentee landlords who lived in England. The Irish survived primarily on potatoes, a crop that grew well in poor soil and provided enough calories to sustain a family on a small plot of land. But they also grew wheat, oats, barley, and raised cattle. These were cash crops. The landlords took them to sell in England. In 1845, a potato blight arrived in Ireland, Phytophthora infestans, a fungal disease that turned potatoes black and inedible. It spread rapidly. Within weeks, the entire potato harvest was destroyed. For Irish peasants, this was catastrophic. Potatoes were their food. Without them, they had nothing. But the wheat, oats, and cattle were still there. Ireland was still producing enormous amounts of food. The British government's response? Minimal. Prime Minister Robert Peel imported some Indian corn from America, but it was not nearly enough. And critically, he refused to stop food exports. Irish-grown wheat, oats, beef, pork, butter, and eggs continued to be shipped to England throughout the famine, every single day. Historians estimate that Ireland produced enough food during the famine years to feed the population 2 to 3 times over, but it was caken. Why? Because the food belonged to the landlords, and the landlords wanted their money. British law protected property rights absolutely. The government could have passed emergency legislation to stop exports or requisition food. They chose not to. Treasury official Charles Trevelyan, the man in charge of famine relief, believed the famine was divine judgment on the Irish for being lazy and overly dependent on potatoes. He wrote that the famine was a direct stroke of an all-wise providence and that providing too much aid would be morally wrong. The relief programs the British did implement were deliberately inadequate. They created workhouses where starving families could go for food, but the conditions were brutal. Families were separated. Men, women, and children housed in different sections. The food was minimal. Disease spread rapidly. Many people died in the workhouses. The government also created public works programs where starving men could work breaking rocks or building roads in exchange for wages, but the wages were below subsistence level. Men worked until they collapsed from hunger. Meanwhile, the exports continued. Armed British soldiers and police escorted wagons of food from Irish farms to the ports. There are documented cases of starving Irish people attacking food convoys, desperately trying to take back the food grown on their own land. They were arrested or shot. The food kept moving to England. By 1847, the famine was at its worst. Entire villages were abandoned. Bodies lay in ditches. Survivors were too weak to bury the dead. Fever and dysentery swept through the starving population. Mothers watched their children die of hunger while carts of grain rolled past their doors. The ports were full of ships loading Irish food bound for England. Some British politicians and landlords did recognize what was happening. They called for the ports to be closed, for exports to be stopped, for real relief. But the government refused. The argument was always the same. Free trade must not be interfered with. Property rights must be protected. The Irish must not become dependent on charity. And so the exports continued, and people died. By 1852, the famine was over. The potato blight had passed, but the damage was permanent. 1 million dead. 1 million more emigrated, mostly to America, fleeing starvation and a government that had abandoned them. Ireland's population dropped from 8.4 million to 6.6 million. Entire communities were erased. The Irish language nearly disappeared. The trauma shaped Irish identity for generations. And the British government? No apology, no accountability. The official position was that they had done what they could within the constraints of economic policy and limited resources. It was a natural disaster. Tragic, but unavoidable. But it was not unavoidable. The food was there. The power to stop the exports was there. The choice to let people die was deliberate.
So here's the question. Could this happen today? Could a country export food while its own population starves? Could a government watch people die and call it unavoidable? Yes, because it already does. Ethiopia, 1984. A massive famine kills over 1 million people. International news coverage shows skeletal children and desperate mothers. The world sends aid. But here is what the coverage did not show. During the famine, Ethiopia was exporting grain. The government was selling food to other countries while its own people starved. Why? To earn foreign currency, to pay debts. The calculation was the same as Ireland 1845. Export revenue was more important than feeding the population. Yemen, 2015 to present. A brutal civil war creates what the UN calls the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. Millions face starvation. But Yemen is not a country without food. It is a country where food is being used as a weapon. Blockades prevent food from reaching certain populations. Starvation is deliberate, a tactic of war. The international community knows and does little. Even in countries not at war, the pattern continues. Around the world, hungry nations export cash crops, coffee, cocoa, sugar, crops that feed wealthier countries while the people who grow them are malnourished. The global food system prioritizes profit over need. Food goes where money is, not where hunger is. Ireland's famine was not unique. It was an extreme example of a pattern that still exists. People starve not because there is no food, but because someone decided that feeding them is not profitable or politically convenient. If you made it this far, thank you. In 1845, Ireland grew enough food to feed its population multiple times over. The British government chose to export it instead. 1 million people starved to death. Politicians called it a natural disaster and refused to interfere with free trade. And today, the same pattern continues. Famine as policy, starvation as choice, food exported while people die. The Great Famine was not a failure of crops. It was a failure of humanity, and it is still failing.
Share this with someone who refuses to look away. Subscribe if you have not. Every episode of If History Repeats asks, what if it happened again? Next episode, April 14th, 1912. The RMS Titanic, largest, most luxurious ship ever built, strikes an iceberg. 1,500 people die. Not because the ship sank, but because there were not enough lifeboats. The ship had capacity for 2,224 passengers. Lifeboat capacity? 1,178. White Star Line knew. They chose not to add more lifeboats because it would clutter the elegant deck. And when the ship went down, third-class passengers were locked below. The unsinkable ship, the missing lifeboats, and the company that decided aesthetics mattered more than lives. I am If History Repeats, and history always has something to say.